Socialism has never worked.
Well, that's the truth of the matter. I mean, you've never seen socialism work anywhere in this world.
It's become a truism repeated by right-wingers and people who just don't know much about political theory.
I would admit the very fact that many of these people just tend to go with an argument because it sounds reasonable and they don't fully comprehend what socialism is. But when you come up against someone like me, I can actually provide a rational and strong argument for why socialism cannot exist outside the realms of authoritarianism, or why socialism most certainly cannot be democratic.
It could be something someone tries to say when you tell them you voted for Bernie Sanders. Psh, Bernie Sanders, don't you know that socialism has never worked?
Well, considering the fact that money only comes from two places, and that's either from the private sector or the printing press, then yes, socialism doesn't work.
Many don't know much about the history of socialism, or even really understand what socialism actually is. They hear the word socialism and they think of authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union or North Korea.
Well, considering the fact that you can't have socialism without authoritarianism, then yes, it is the only regimes you could possibly have under socialism.
They might say, hey, socialism doesn't work when they're having a conversation about someone like Barack Obama, implying that Obama is himself a socialist.
We know that somewhere along the line there has been socialist government intervention to some degree or another, whether it was the internal improvements, which is the corporate subsidies of the 19th century, or the protectionist tariffs, or the fixing of the ratio, or you'll love this one, the fixing of the interest rates, done through your central banking system. Socialism is not something simplistic. Okay, you don't live under a full-blown socialist system, but you live in a mixed economy, and even to a varying degree, when you look back in the 19th century, there was socialism present to some degree or another, and everywhere that you saw socialism, it was a failure. It was a failure with the fixing of the ratio, with the fixing of interest rates. Now, as I said the word central. David Pakman, you're the type of person who would try and erroneously claim that just because it's called a private bank that somehow this means capitalism. Yeah, don't even bother telling the people that it's a central banking system, meaning political centralization. That's right, political centralization, which defines socialism.
I am not a socialist, but I can only understand that if I actually know what socialism is. So let's begin there. Defined by a textbook, socialism is the collective ownership of a society's means of production. Means of production could be non-human resources used to produce things of economic value like real estate or farmland, natural resources, equipment, buildings, infrastructure, roads, and collective ownership of these things meaning workers or the public own them.
You oversimplify the entire meaning of socialism around that of collective ownership of the means of production. It pertains to collective control over the means of production, and also is defined by political centralization. And you ignore the fact it's defined by political central planning. And you ignore the fact it's defined by state direction of the economy as a whole. Yes, when we talk about that of a private sector that's being over-regulated by the state, giving the state the power to control and direct the private industry through strong government regulation. Yes, it's still socialist. When the state strongly regulates private industry, the private industry is as good as government ownership. In many regards, the likes of President Obama was to a varying degree, to a certain extent, socialist in many regards. Not to the extreme of the likes of Hitler or Stalin or Mao etc.
Some define socialism as a system by which social equality can be achieved. In this broader way of thinking about it, socialism could mean any kind of socialistic philosophies or attitudes or tendencies, or a system that combines orthodox socialist practices with other constructs like capitalism. For instance, you could say that some Scandinavian countries are socialistic by modern standards, not because they have a system where the government or workers own everything, but because they have a system where there's a relatively greater amount of intervention by democratic government.
You've basically conceded to the fact that the government intervention in those Scandinavian economies is socialistic in many regards. The government intervention in those economies didn't lead to any sort of economic success whatsoever. The most successful economic time period in Sweden's history was between 1870 to 1960, when it was strongly free from government intervention. How did socialism work again? Did it work with the minimum wage law? No. Did it work with that of, raising the tax rates? No. Did it work with the big extensive welfare state? Well, look at Sweden before 1960, proven by the Gini coefficient. They never had the big extensive welfare state. They had extremely low levels of government regulation, low tax rates. They had high levels of equality, and yet along comes the strong government regulation, the higher tax rates, the big extensive welfare state, and lo and behold, they dropped from 4th richest nation per capita GDP in the world down to the 14th richest. Explain to me again how that was successful?
To protect socialistic ideals like egalitarianism, civil rights, equal education, environmentalism, and the prevention of abuse by actors in the free market.
I love how you touch upon the equality with regards to rights. The consequences of your actions is the fact that through your coercion, in other words, there's no such thing as socialism existing without authoritarianism, under individualism, under capitalism, rights are negative rights. Therefore, we have the right to agree to disagree. Me as an individual, under individualism, I would have the right to earn 100% of my earnings. And if I ran a business, I would have the free right to serve who I wish to serve out of free choice. And no one can force me to do so, right? That's my individual right to who I serve business to. In other words, you're the type of person who would go around saying that healthcare is a right. How is it egalitarian to say that your right to say healthcare is a right, but then you ignore the rights of the individual, such as individuals being the doctors and nurses? What if they disagree? Well, what you've essentially done is you've stripped them of their rights. You've taken their rights away. So there's nothing egalitarian about it. Positive rights are not egalitarian. You, under positive rights, seem to think your right is greater than my right to disagree.
These are capitalist societies, and they're definitely not realizations of socialism as defined in a political science glossary. But these are manifestations of socialistic inclinations, especially when compared to what goes on in many other developed countries. Socialism is an extremely broad umbrella term to describe a wide range of political, social, and economic systems, movements, and ideas.
You are correct in saying that things are a lot more of a broader brush with regards to socialism. It's not as simple as, defining it around a political theory of socialism to say, well, it's communism, end of story. It isn't just defined around a political theory. Yes, political centralization is socialist. Political central planning is socialist. And I know you won't like it, but fascism is certainly socialist. Socialism cannot be democratic, and it cannot be libertarian. And do you want to know why that is? When it comes down to socialism in practice, it defies human nature and it defies the laws of economics. Now, what destroys your entire argument about all these different types of socialism, because you probably believe in democratic socialism, is the very issue to do with the economic calculation problem and the knowledge problem, and there goes your whole idea of democratic socialism out the window.
Some elements of socialism have ancient roots. Ancient Buddhism taught that the individual and all other living beings are interconnected and interdependent, and that all humans should be treated equally and with kindness.
What on earth has individuals of society being treated equally got to do with that of socialism? Absolutely nothing. You know what equality used to stand for? Equality used to mean that it was equal opportunity. Now, equality meant that we didn't all finish in the same position and that we would be treated equally as people. But what we do not believe in is stripping a specific group of people of their individual rights and then trying to place another group of individuals' rights above their rights and then trying to pass that off as equality.
Now, this might get awkward for anti-socialist Christian conservatives, but the New Testament is also chock full of socialist themes. Jesus advocated that all people, including governments, should provide for the poor and distribute resources according to people's needs.
I'm not a religious person, but of course, being an Episcopalian, whatever the hell that is, something to do with the English church or something, what does that matter? Just because Jesus believed so, does that somehow make it right? Does that mean it works? No. Doesn't mean anything. It's not even an argument.
And then over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, there were many, many different philosophies that branched out of this to form separate socialist intellectual movements. This is where the idea that socialism means any one thing is dispelled.
Economic calculation problem and knowledge problem. Your argument is completely finished, and I've already explained that. Maybe people who don't really fully comprehend why socialism doesn't work. But see, when you actually understand the economic calculation problem, see when you understand why socialism doesn't work, it doesn't matter whether you talk about libertarian socialism, a fucking oxymoron, or that of democratic socialism, another oxymoron. It doesn't matter what you argue for, and I'll tell you the reason why. I'll explain very clear in English why you are screwed. There's only two places money comes from. And you require money in order to pay people's wages. Even if you did argue for a moneyless based economy, you're faced with the economic calculation problem because there's no information of prices. How therefore do you know how much to produce? Or even what to produce more of? Or where to allocate the scarce natural resources? You don't. Or even if you argue for government price controls, which distorts the information of profits and losses, either side of that, you're done. You cannot have democracy because the government doesn't know your needs and wants. It's impossible.
One of the first schools of socialist thought was utopian socialism.
What exactly do you mean by utopian socialism? Socialism is utopian. The idea of socialism being libertarian is utopian.
Then there's Marxism. Now, many people refer to Marxism colloquially as communism, even though communism can actually describe an array of different systems, some of which don't even involve a state, which I'll touch on in a second.
How the hell did you differentiate utopian socialism from that of Marxism?
But as an ultra-simplified overview, political Marxism is centered around class struggle, revolution, and Marx's historical theory of materialism. Marxism advocates a revolution wherein a society's means of production are taken by force, rather than by reform or negotiation or slower forms of transition. The means of production will then be controlled by a proletarian state, which in theory will lead to an egalitarian, stateless society that governs itself without coercive institutions. Really important point here. This is not what the Soviet Union or its, quote, communist successors achieved or were working toward, despite their pretenses.
Oh, here we go. Here we go again. This was not the Soviet Union. Look, just stop the theoretical absolute pish, okay? People like you are so far removed from reality. You have no idea how stupid that argument is. Just because you intend for something to be that way, it doesn't mean it turns out that way in practice. That's why it's the true face of communism. You might not like the fact that that was the true face of communism, but it is. That's what communism is. You don't understand practice and theory. That's a bit like me saying, I'll write the book of how the theories of how pigs can fly, But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't work in practice because of the laws of gravity. This is no different to socialism. Don't you get that? When you put socialism into practice, you can't ignore the economic calculation problem. You can't ignore the knowledge problem. You're fucked. That's it. That's why socialism doesn't work. Because in practice, you will always destroy the information of prices, which in turn results to a self-serving government, because the government doesn't know your needs and wants. That's why the Soviet Union was faced with all the food shortage problems and the surplus waste problems of, pelts, and the surplus waste of the shoe production in the late 1980s. It's why the Soviet Union was faced with the problems of what it did. Now, like I said, since money only comes from two places, the private sector or the printing press, and since you cannot finance an economy off the back of the printing press, as you would lead the country towards hyperinflation, that essentially means, in practice, never mind your theoretical pish, in practice, it means you cannot get rid of the private sector.
This type of anarchism actually manifested in Catalonia, Spain, right before World War II. In this instance, socialism worked.
No, it didn't. No, it didn't. There was no anarchy in Catalonia. A terror group formed, and a special interest group of people were given special privilege to terrorise people into their regime.
Modern social democracies allow egalitarianism, things like social welfare, universal healthcare, and representative democracy to flourish within the context of capitalism. Think of countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Sweden. So modern social democracy is sometimes referred to as the Nordic model. These countries have free college, free graduate school, free or inexpensive world-class healthcare.
Here comes the argument again about the free this and the free that and the free this, that and the next thing. No, they're not free. They're not free because it's a hidden cost. They're not free because they're paying out their eyeballs in order to afford to pay for it. If it was that free, then why are they sitting with a high unemployment rate, 3 times higher than official figures in Denmark? Is that how free it is? Is it that free that their cost of living is soared through the roof? Must be so free that they have some of the highest suicide rates in the world. Is that how free it is? It's not free. Money has to come from somewhere to pay for it. How else do you think they pay for the computers in the schools? How do you think they pay for the jotters? How do you think they pay for all the books that they get? How do you think they pay for the entire buildings? How do you think they pay for all the school material? How do you think the teachers get paid wages? You think that just falls out the fucking sky? It's not free. It's time to put an end to this stupid word free. It's a bit like saying, yes, the NHS is free, but guess what, everybody? It's £120 billion per year. How's that free?
Paid through taxes, compared to other developed countries, generally speaking.
And you just sat there and you said that it's free, but it's paid through taxes. I don't even understand how you can even, say that with a straight face. And then the issue that you ignore is the fact that it doesn't just come from taxes. So I love how you actually try to pass that off. It doesn't just come from taxes. It comes from other areas of the economy. How convenient of you to ignore that fact. Now, I live in socialist Scotland. I love calling it that. I live in socialist Scotland with your so-called world-class free education and your free tuition fees of university and your, free healthcare and the free prescriptions. Yeah, I live in that. And I can tell you from experience that if you go on the job centre and if you go on and you look for jobs, most of the jobs are down south in England.
The right wing or conservative or classical liberal dogma in the US is that higher taxes and a strong public sector are just awful. They say these things inhibit economic growth and innovation, or that the welfare state and thorough regulation of markets is unsustainable, or even that these things endanger individual liberty. As progressives, we know that's not true, or really anyone who looks at the data or has studied truly democratic applications of socialism would know that's not true.
I'm sorry to say, but that is the truth. Where have you ever seen a successful economy with higher tax rates?
Look at Scandinavian countries today, or even countries like France, Ireland, Canada, and New Zealand, which share some of the same characteristics.
You mean the Scandinavian countries where Kongsberg Automotive in Norway only has 5% of its workforce left in Norway because it can't afford to produce in its own home country, where it's got high inflationary problems, meaning a severe lack of productivity in its domestic economy because it can't afford to produce in its own home country? You mean that sort of success? Or do you mean the Denmark that's sitting with a real unemployment rate 3 times higher than official figures? Well, hold on a second here. I thought that was successful. But hold on. High prices in the market signify scarcity, and the Scandinavian economies are sitting with extremely high costs of living. That's what you call successful. I'm done.